Hi guys, it's Joey, and the title of this video is going to be Moths, Magic and Badb. So first and foremost, I apologise, I haven't got a physical image of a moth to put in front of you. I will look through all my tarot decks that I own. I don't own that many, I'm small in my tarot deck, to check out the imagery, and I couldn't find a single image of a moth. So I checked on Google Images, and one of the really amazing depictions of moth within tarot imagery, which I think works really well in terms of symbolism and spiritual meaning, is by the Wooden Tarot. So if you want to Google an image, that is definitely the one to go for. And it's a beautiful tarot deck, absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to be sipping tea, and we shall go into some deep symbolic meanings and a talk about moth. I have some images in front of you which kind of tailor makes a moth, it kind of looks a bit like a moth, sort of, but the energies are all aligned and the visuals are aligned with some of the messages that have come through. So I decided to do this video to take it sort of beyond a totem animal type exploration, because the moth has been haunting my images recently. I've been surrounded by moths in the physical realm, they keep popping up, and in the sort of symbolic realm as well, so images keep cropping up that have moth imagery tied to them, and even to the point where I the other day made a spelling error and said moth instead of month. So I was like, okay, we will sit and we will figure out what's going on with this message. And I decided, as I was doing the research and the feeling out the energies on my own sort of interpretations of this energy, that this was something that was worth sharing. It has a Morrigan correlation, particularly to Badb, and I haven't ever seen that stated anywhere, to my knowledge. But we'll get to that bit in a minute. But we're going to sort of talk about moths in a general fashion first, their general meanings, and then move on to that imagery and why I arrived at that conclusion. If I trip over my words a bit, you have to forgive me. I'm still too warm, and the hay fever and all the rest of it muddles my head. So moths have very similar symbolism to butterflies, with some key differences. Okay, I've got plenty of images of butterflies, none of moths. The main difference is that the moth is nocturnal, and nocturnal creatures correlate to dream work, shadows, otherworldliness, secret knowledge and psychic awareness. Standardized moth meanings are vulnerability, determination, concealment, attraction, subtlety, intuition, and faith. Even in navigation, when we observe the moth to fly into artificial light or flames, the moth demonstrates its faith and determination. Even at the risk of losing its own life, the moth is ever vigilant in following the path of light. This may also serve as a moral to us to keep vigilant and not be a victim of blind faith. So I'm just going to stop here and mention that the idea of not having blind faith is something I've discussed with a couple of people in my private sphere quite a lot recently. It's been one of these themes, and a lot of the themes that come up have been things that have been coming up for me time and time again, and moth energies tie them together. And questioning everything, especially on a spiritual path, is one of the messages that I felt came across strongly within the last few weeks. That taking anything on blind faith is a bad idea, and that we should be questioning everything and investigating and seeking. There is also a fragile vulnerability in the moth. The moon is her mother, and she will follow her at all costs. This makes her open to distraction and vulnerable to harm. Here we may find another message to adjust our course as the path indicates, rather than drive forward without heeding important signs along the way. I'm just going to take a sip of my drink. As a creature of the night, creature of the night. I'm not going to sing Rocky Horror. I'm not. Okay. And as a creature of the night and by her navigational devices, we see the moth is highly influenced by the power of the moon. This aspect ties in with symbolism of intuition and psychic awareness. So for that reason we have some selenite and a midnight moonstone in shot. And we've just had the full moon as well, so in terms of energies where we are in a sort of astrological aspect, it ties into that as well. The moth continues to be under the influence of matters of love. She emits pheromones that are powerfully strong, attracting her male counterpart through the dark nights. These scented trails can be followed for remarkable distances. Therefore, further moth symbolism includes suggestion, attraction, and allure. A master of disguise, the moth can blend into the environment to the point of invisibility. This is a metaphor for us to use our environment to our advantage, to blend in when necessary, adjust and adapt when the situation requires it. So usually at this point, once I took the basic information of the moth totem and symbolism, I would then go into my own tarot and sort of delve a little bit deeper by taking the imagery that I most connect to in my tarot decks and presenting how I feel about it. But in this case, I couldn't, because my decks don't have it. So I made a couple of notes about the moth from the wooden tarot deck, which correlates to the magician in that particular deck. And it has a skull on its body, and there is a lemon scale or a figure 8 on its side. It's the symbol of eternity underneath in the form of a twisting vine. And it correlates to the idea of being in control of our own journey, questioning of one's blind faith, looking inward as well as outward, and the determination and will to overcome all difficulties, to leave our own trail, to generate our own life and make our own questions and things of that nature. So in that regard, the moth imagery tied in really beautifully with that particular tarot deck. And of course the lemon scale is the symbol of eternity, so life, death and rebirth. There is also a correlation I've noticed I'll say this week with the moth energy, and seeing the Latin memento mori, remember to die, remember you must die. And this correlates quite frequently to moth imagery, and moth being in artwork that centres around this theme. The artwork of Molto Pugliese, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. It's spelt Malteo Pugliese. So his artwork, entitled Memento a Mori, as a pun on Memento Mori, depicts skulls in bronze, and unfortunately ivy, that are made up of figures in sexual trysts. And the idea is love and death are the twin engines of eroticism. Memento Mori appears to be a reminder of mortality, which attracts different lessons in philosophy depending on the mind of the recipient. In a Christianized sense, it's come to reflect an image of perfecting one's character in life in fear of eternal judgment and damnation. The fragility of life, however, is the key theme. Life is short. Some focus on the afterlife as a result of this thought process, and others focus on the process of living. So the idea of memento mori, the concept that, remember to die, remember we all die, we must all die, has come up in correlation to moth imagery in a number of ways. I've seen that phrase frequently this week alongside seeing a lot of moth imagery. So the two sort of spoke and correlated to me. There are images within that concept, artworks that utilise moths as well as skulls, and the combination of the two is frequent. And as I was sat there thinking about it, I realised that recently there's been a lot of Badb energy in my life, and Badb being the crone aspect of the Morrigan. And it tends to vary the strength of the particular aspects of the Morrigan, or it can, just be the Morrigan as is, sort of in her inverted commas whole form, if you like. But Badb has definitely been making her presence known in all sorts of ways recently. And as I sat and thought about it, I was like, this correlates to Badb, and this is my reasoning. As a nocturnal lunar creature, moth reflects the idea of dark lessons alongside travelling to the light, which is often a description from near-death experiences. Badb being the death aspect of the Morrigan in particular, although I always feel that you can't pin one little label on each one because they flux into one another. She's a shape-shifting goddess, the Morrigan, so she shifts through life, death and rebirth and all of her aspects, and they all interflow into one another, and one cannot be directly attributed to each aspect. However, Badb tends to appear as the death crone, and I've seen her as maiden as well. As a creature of invisibility, the moth links to imagery of the Phantom Queen, and Badb as a holy host of ghosts, sounds like a song, is a documented phenomenon within the lore, and the being of the shrieking banshee and that sort of thing. And actually the shrieking comes into it now. Death head moths. Now death head moths have a skull on their body. Squeak when disturbed. Badb screams, usually when disturbed, when she is delivering a message, when she is angry, when she's announcing battle or death. The death head moth, marked with a skull, has received negative attention and negative association throughout history because of this image. Most recently that I can think of is in Hannibal, the movie, rather than the TV series. With this, I'm pretty sure it's Silence of the Lambs actually, where it's the moth over the woman's mouth, and that's a pretty famous visual from the movie realm, and that's a negative association with the death head moth, simply because there's a skull. The Morrigan as a whole, and particularly Badb, are similarly met with apprehension and fear, and the skull imagery connects the two via visual representation. Skulls were collected by Morrigan, as the Celts believed the soul to reside in the head. So when she was said to be collecting heads, she was carrying the souls of the dead to the other world, this being one of her functions in the aspect of death. I've also had personal experience with Badb appearing quite skeletal when she manifests, so that correlation is even stronger in my mind. Another key theme which has come up a lot recently is the intimate relationship of sex and death. This is tied intimately to the Morrigan in many ways, and nowhere as keenly as with Badb, particularly given her death aspect. This ties back to the memento mori that we mentioned earlier, particularly the love and death being twin engines of eroticism. And as I said, the skull artwork then ties back to the idea of soul being in the head within the Celtic mythos, and Morrigan collecting skulls, and skulls being associated both with the Morrigan and then the moth through the death head moth imagery. Therefore tying to the memento mori artwork, therefore tying to those skull images particularly that were made up of figures in all sorts of sexual trysts by Malto Pugalis, I think. You pronounce it. Badb in particular is associated with crow, which was seen to be consuming the dead on the battlefield. The consumption of the dead on the battlefield by the Celts, by the crows, not by the Celts. The Celts saw this as a symbolic act, that the crows were taking on the souls of the dead to the other world, very much like Morrigan taking heads. But there is this idea behind it of once the crows ingested the person, they would assume all that knowledge, the life force of that person, the memories, and that being very much tied into your sex and death thing. So all your life and life essence and life energies, the throbbingness of life, if you like, would be taken into those crows. And crow in particular is associated with Badb. Red mouth Badb is one of her descriptions, and this ties into the consumption as well as death and life force in one physical attribute. The moth is intimately connected to the otherworld as a nocturnal creature, and sensuality and allure, as we talked about earlier, through its pheromones. Therefore, the moth correlates within energies of the nocturnal and energies of the otherworld, particularly that tunneling towards the light, that idea of sort of death, but not necessarily physical death either. It can be, seeking the light within one's life to sort of overcome death cycles, and going into the dark places to heal oneself, and to go into the other world to seek divinational knowledge, and the other world being tied to Badb completely. The sensuality and allure of the crossover of the sex death aspect is something that I've talked about quite a lot recently, and I always bring up the example of the French le petit mort, the little death. That I saw that in imagery this week as well, with skeletons, as it happened, more skull imagery. There's been a lot of skulls this week. Skulls and moths everywhere. It's a good job it doesn't bother me in the slightest. So I think I think that was all of the ideas that I wanted to pinpoint with regards to this is my evidence for believing moths are associated with Badb in particular. And it's interesting when these sorts of things appear, because I've been very aware of Badb being quite active lately, and I've been very aware, I've been very aware of moth imagery, but because it's not a creature that appears in the ancient texts that we have access to, as I'm sure much knowledge has already been lost from that time, it tends to leave one wondering whether or not this is something that you should apply. Is this moth giving me an image of the Morrigan? Is this a message from the Morrigan? Are the two symbolisms related? Do they correlate? Is there a message in between the two? And I thought this would be a prime example of letting people see that sometimes you have to apply what you know with what resonates with you on a psychological and symbolic level. That sometimes the messages are a little bit more vague and take a little bit more of a thought process and a feeling out, if you like. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. I thought that was interesting. And that will be it for Moth, Magic and Badb. Many blessings.